This first day is going to be somewhat review. A lot of this you should have seen from the bootcamp prep start materials. What is an object, and the basic fundamentals of it. An object is in JavaScript is what we call a collection of key value pairs. In Python, it's called a dictionary, and I actually like that terminology a little bit better, right? If I was to think of a dictionary, I can think of it as a collection of what? Words and definitions, right? Those are only two things that exist in a dictionary. So in JavaScript, when we say a key value pair, you can think of it as a word, which is a key, and the definition, which is the value, right? So key value pair is just word definition pairs, and an object is just a group of those. So it's like the way that a dictionary is just a group of words and their definitions. You probably remember how with arrays, we have everything stored and we access it by giving you an index saying, I want the first thing, I want the second thing, I want the numerical position of the thing, right? In objects, we still use bracket notation, but rather than passing in a position or a number, we pass in a string, right? Because basically at this point what we're saying is, hey, here's a word, I want the definition, right? So down here on the bottom, we see for this my object, we have key 1, which corresponds to value 1. We have key 2, which corresponds to value 2. Notice how they're separated by a comma. And if I say, hey, what's key 1 in this object or in this dictionary, the answer is going to be value 1, right? That's going to be the definition if you will, or the value associated with that key. Why do we use objects? Really, because if you think about yesterday when we did the zoo inventory problem, remember how painful it was to kind of always just kind of say, oh, I think the first thing in the array is always going to be a name of the animal. I think the second thing is always going to be the age, and the third thing might be the species. There's a lot of kind of assumptions and things you it's kind of like secret knowledge. You kind of know it, but you don't really know it. Because objects let you associate a key with a value, you can now actually say this value is this, right? And so it just makes it a lot more. It makes it a lot more kind of clear what we're looking at. So up here we have a cat that we use for today's examples. Pusheen, 7, Gray, and Tabby. Sure, if I keep it in an array, I can probably infer what those things are. If I put it in an object and I give Pusheen the key of name, 7 the key of age, and then Gray and Tabby the key of color. Well, now anyone reading this, there's no ambiguity, right? Name is Pusheen, age is 7, color is Gray and Tabby. So one of the really kind of more applicable use cases of objects is it really makes it easy. It gives you additional context or additional information about what you're looking at. Quick slide, type of object is an object. However, type of array is also an object. So that's why we use array.isArray. Creating an object. Oh, that was fast. Okay, creating an object is the way we create any other variables in JavaScript, right? We still have our left keyword there. We name it, set it equal to, and then here we use our curly braces. Everything up until now when we used curly braces, it was in context of a function or a loop. In this case, the curly braces actually just denote the beginning and the end of our object, right? Everything in between the curly braces is going to be something followed by a colon, followed by the value, and then we separate each of these key value pairs with a comma. Notice how in the earlier slide, this key had quotes around it to denote that it was a string. Here it doesn't, and the reason for this is because in JavaScript, the key has to always be a string. You cannot have a number as a key. You cannot have a boolean or a function or another array or an object as a key, right? Just like how in the dictionary, right? For the definition could be anything you want. It could be a picture. It could be it could be a number. It could be something else, right? But the word is always alphabetical, right? So if I define what pi is, maybe the word pi is spelled pi, but the definition could be 3.14, whatever it is. So here in JavaScript, the key is always going to be a string. The value could be any data type. It could be a boolean, could be an object, could be an array, could be a number, or whatever it is. But once again, the key is always going to be a string. And so here, when we write name down, JavaScript's going to actually just going to say, oh, I think, well, what JavaScript's going to do is JavaScript's actually going to say, okay, whatever key you gave it, I'm going to convert it to a string first before I store anything. Because once again, like that's how strong that underlying assumption is, that the keys of an object can only ever be strings. Values can be anything you want. Keys can only be strings. Can't emphasize that enough. Any questions there?
Even functions? Can you make the value a function?
Yeah, the value can be a function. A value can be another object. It can be anything you want it to be. The keys have to be strings. Everything else is, everything on the value side of it is fair game. And then just don't forget to separate everything with a comma. I mean, it's actually not that bad because if you do, JavaScript will probably stop and throw an error and saying it doesn't recognize what it is. But just don't forget the comma, especially when you write it like this, because people might see it online like, oh, that's great. Like clearly this is an object, but if you don't have the comma, the computer can't read it. Oh, sorry.
So if it is something like a function, it wouldn't be an expression, a function expression. It would be like, how would you, or would it be like a function column?
It could be either. It could be a variable representing a function or a function expression. We cover it tomorrow actually, okay. So you'll see in tomorrow's slides. Okay. But for today, you don't need to worry about it. But yes, it's possible. Okay. Yeah. All right. Accessing a value. Well, great. I mean, we've kind of covered this in the first slide already, right? How do we access the value? Remember, value, right? Key value. We access a value by giving the key, right? If I was to go into a dictionary and said, hey, you know, here's a word, the dictionary is not going to give me back the word again. It's going to give me back what? The definition. So if I go to an object and I say, here's a key, it's not going to give me back the key again. It's going to give me back the value associated with the key. Okay, super critical. This is probably the one thing I was saying that people have a hard time with the objects workshop is in their minds, they're not super clear about the key versus a value. And so if you need to like print it out if you want in your code, like write it down somewhere on paper, like the key and the value, okay? The key is associated with the value. If I give an object a key, it's going to give me back the value associated with the key, okay? And the key is always going to be a string. The value can be anything. So here, to access it, I pass in this string called name, and it's going to give me back, not name, it's going to give me back the string Pushing, right? Because that's the value associated with the name key. And even though, once again, this is not in quotes, this is a string because it has to be. Or because JavaScript kind of handles that behind the scenes. One last thing you'll see here is if I try to access a key that's not in the object, I don't get an error, which I guess could be a good or a bad thing. I get back undefined. Much like how with an array, if I have an array of 5 things and I say, hey, give me the thing at index 6 or index 5, I don't get back an error, I get back undefined. Because JavaScript is going to basically saying, hey, you know, this could exist, you just haven't really created it yet. So just something to kind of be aware of. So don't count on JavaScript to throw an error at you, it's going to throw back an undefined instead. Okay. Another way to access it, we can obviously also do expressions in here too, right? Just like math, in JavaScript, there's a certain order of operations, right? Things in a parentheses get evaluated first, da-da-da. In this case, things in this bracket is going to get evaluated first before we try to access it. So in this case, col plus or is going to give us a string color, and then we're going to look up color. Here, notice how on line 12, key to check. We actually don't know what data type that is just yet, or I mean, we do, but notice how there's no quotes around it, right? So in JavaScript's eyes, that's actually a variable, right? So when JavaScript sees this, it's not going to say, okay, give me a key, look up the key to check. It's going to say, what variable does this correspond to? Oh, okay, it corresponds to this string called name. So once again, it would then feed name it would feed in name here, and it would look up the value associated with name in the object. Ariana?
In line 13, where the key color is broken up, why would anyone do that?
Well, what if one half of that was a variable? Right? So let's say I have a dictionary, right? I have a bunch of keys, word 1, word 2, word 3, word 4, word 5. and then someone's trying to access every single word, right? I could easily have a for loop where instead of having COL plus OR, I do the string word plus the number of the index, right? So word 1, word 2, word 3. Maybe that was a bit of a contrived example, but in this case, we're adding 2 strings, which seems kind of silly. But if one of these was a variable, and we're trying to access a whole list of keys, that's very possible. And then Josh, your question 2.
Yeah, what if... Oh, I answered my question.
Awesome. Great.
So wouldn't it though coerce the variable into a string?
Exactly.
The first.
Yep. And that's what we want.
So.
No, we can code it up. It'll take us like 2 minutes. Oh, hello. All right, let's make it smaller. Okay, so let's say I have something called obj equals, and I have word 1, which is the value of 1. I just copy and paste this over and over again. Okay. Good so far? Those are all right. That's a proper object. And then if I do for let I equal 0, I equal 1, I is less than 1, 2, 3, 4, I plus plus. Like if I do console.log out, obj index of here, I'm going to say word plus I. Right? Like this is an example of which, okay, like I'm not adding 2 strings necessarily, but I am adding 2 things, right? And I absolutely want them to be coerced into a string because that's how my keys are in the object. Yeah, Jake?
If you wanted to, like, not hard code the 4 in there, would you be able to do obj.length, or does that not work?
We'll talk about ways to get the keys and the values in an array format, but there is a way to do it without hard coding it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So yep. Yeah, no problem. And then lastly here, this is the one that like I'll talk about, but I don't necessarily like it for this particular class. And the reason why is because one thing you also see is a lot of times people, once again, they're lazy. They want to kind of write more simple, like clean code. So another way to access a particular key in a JavaScript object is to actually just do dot and then the name of the key, right? So in order for it to get a name, we could do Pusheen brackets the string name, or we could just do Pusheen.name. That also works. However, notice a few things, right? One is there's no quotes around name. And once again, this is because when JavaScript sees that, JavaScript's assuming, well, if you want to access this property, and the property, or you're trying to access this key, and because a key can only be strings, I'm going to take whatever you gave me and convert it to a string first, right? So it kind of enforces that on you. But the main reason why I don't like it is a few things, right? One is before we could pass variables into the square brackets to dynamically change the name of the key. In this way, you can't, right? Because JavaScript doesn't give you the chance. It just takes whatever you do and automatically converts it into a string. So even though on line 9 here we have key to check goes name, here when we do Pusheen.key to name, JavaScript will say, oh, you actually are looking for a key called key to name, and that's why we get back undefined up here. So that notation has its limitations. The biggest one is that it obviously doesn't take in variables. Other limitations include it's not really possible to access keys with spaces or with certain special characters in there as well. So bracket notation will always work. Dot notation will work most of the time, but there are limitations. So in your code, if you're using dot notation and you're really having a hard time, try using bracket notation. It's definitely a lot safer. Yeah, Josh.
Could the object name be a variable? Like object.name? And then you could push Pusheen into that variable?
Sorry, say that one more time.
So
Well, Pusheen is a variable, right?
So could that be a variable?
Oh, pushing is a variable. Right?
You could push a variable into another variable. Like if you wanted to console log multiple, like if you had let machine 1, machine 2, machine 3, and iterate over I to 1 through 3, and then have it be object I dot name.
Object I dot name. What does object I mean?
Oh, because you like at the in the loop 1, 2, 3. So I is 1, I is 2, I is 3.
Right, but how would you represent that?
Well, I guess it's the same.
How do you type object I? If you do object index I, it means you're trying to access the I key of the of the object, right? So it's not like once you start doing that, you realize there's not even a way for you to type that.
I think part of the issue is that the key is always a string, but variable names are not strings. Variable names are, right?
What do you mean? Like, give me an example of a variable that's not a variable name that's not a string.
I mean, like, he's talking about trying to, like, say, like, let's you have a bunch of variables it doesn't even have to be objects, like, let word 1 equal a string, and then word 2 equal a string.
Sure.
If you wanted to print, if you go back to previous example.
Yep. So let's type it out. So I'm just gonna come out. Okay. So let word 1 equal a string.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's call it foo. And then what's next?
Let word 2, and then on the next line, yeah, exactly. Is this what you were asking about, basically? Like,
Well, I was
but
thinking-
is it like pushing 1, pushing 2, pushing 3?
You know, like if you said let machine equal the object, and then let word 1 equal machine, then could you do word 1 dot name and get the right answer?
Oh yeah, totally. Because if you like, so what you're saying is oh sorry. So sorry for not understanding your question earlier. Then.
I thought we said it poorly.
Oh, I thought you were asking something else. I thought what you were asking is if I
Well,
create.
I complicated that first principle by saying if you could do like
Right.
plus or.
So what you're saying is like if I do something like this now, can I do like foobar dot word 1?
Exactly.
Oh yeah, totally.
But you can't use the plus and like make it complicated like you can with bracket notation.
Not with that no
Yeah,
notation, but this
That was
is
I guess I had 2 questions in one. That was my
okay. Cool. So this is totally fair game too. What I thought you were asking is if I have something like object 1, and then I create another one called object 2 like this.
Yeah, that was.
Is there a way to access object 1 and object 2 iteratively, like through a loop? And the answer is not really, because like there's no way to, like you can't call a variable by like you can't call a variable like a variable is something that kind of exists in itself. You can't like create a variable name that way, right? So like if I was to say like like oh like if I wanted to object 2 dot word 1. Like something like obj plus 2 dot word 1 is not going to work because this is going to be a string, right? And so it feels like you're telling me to do a string of word 1, right? So like there's no way to even type this out, so therefore you can't really represent it that way.
That's what I was trying to say.
Gotcha.
Oh,
Yeah.
Because it's a string.
Right, because variables because variables are what variables are is they're essentially like think of it as like an address to a particular place on a computer's memory chip that stores information. And so whenever you're using a variable, you're doing is you're pointing to that address. So yeah, like it's you can like kind of play around with it the same way you play around with a string. So I guess yes, you're right that variable names are not strings technically. Yeah. And I guess by definition then the keys of an object are also not variables, right? They're strings because we are able to play around with it the way we do normal strings.
I have another question.
What's up?
Can you scroll down a little bit?
Sure.
So I don't know if, like what Josh was asking before with like the OBJ and then like finding each index from it, but if you were to do it the way you had foobar, like you renamed the object to, like you assign the object to the variable foobar, would you be able to put like word plus I if it was in a loop and it would literally just print out every word So that was kind of what I was asking about, the dot length and I guess.
Well, I thought you were asking like how do we not hard code the for?
I think I also might have had 2 questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but that's fine because I get.
Yeah, so we could, so here if I want to do this, right, I could also very easily do something like, so now here I can just do foobar, and that would still work. Did I, oh, I commented out object. Like that still works here, right? So it doesn't matter if I use foobar here or object, they're pointing to the same object. Or the same, yeah. OBJ and foobar are both pointing to the same object at this point. All right, cool. So that's how to access the values with dot notation as well. Adding a key value pair is super straightforward. You literally just write the key and you use an equal sign and you create it like we do every other variable we've ever created in JavaScript. So it's the same way how like if we do like array index of 0 equals this, object dot key equals this, and now equals the value. And so we'll now automatically add this key value pair into your object. And then changing a value is also super simple. It's literally the same as assigning, it's creating a value. You're basically creating a new key value pair that overrides it. Like if that key exists, it will override the previous key value pair with whatever new thing you have. So it looks identical to the way that you would create a new key value pair in an object as well. Every object can only have like, every key in an object has to be distinct, right? If you try to create a duplicate key value pair or a duplicate key, you'll just be overriding the previous key value with whatever your new key value is. Make sense? It's like how every dictionary can only have one definition for a word. If you update the definition for that word, you'll just override the previous definition. You're not going to have 2 definitions concurrently with the same word.
And similarly, you wouldn't be able to change a key and keep the value. It wouldn't be like, let's say you misspelled name, you can't alter the key for that key value pair. You have to like delete it and then add a new one where you spell it correctly.
Yeah. What you would probably do is, you would just access that definition and reuse that value again somewhere else.
I feel like I'm learning how to make like a social media website, like learning how to change values, add things to groups. I don't know.
Yeah.
I always like when you're teaching this kind of stuff. I look at it and I can't help but think about like your Facebook bio, like about me and stuff like that. Like if this is how they would do that kind of thing.
If you use most APIs, this is how you're represented. Like if I was to say, maybe not Facebook because they're super like private with most things.
Yeah.
But with most sites, it's kind of like if I tried to get like a Jake object, I would get back an object, and they would literally tell me all these things about it. Like Jake, first name Jake, last name Ghosting, like profession programmer, right? Like it would just do all these things like in sequence.
Yeah.
And once again, like that's exactly why objects are so commonly used, because they will literally hold anything you want and kind of tell you what it is in the same go. Lastly is a delete keyword. So you are able to delete a key value pair in JavaScript. You can't delete just a value because, well, you can, but that's not really deleting. That's just what, overriding the value with something else, right? So delete means you're trying to delete both the key and the value. It's also not used very commonly because most times if you have an object with like an extra key value pair, people just don't use it, right? You know how like with an array, it's like if you have an extra thing, it throws everything else's sequence off. In objects, there's no sense of order. So if you have an extra key value pair, people are just like, oh yeah, just don't use it, and you're fine. So like you could delete it, but it's just not very common practice to do so, unless of course you're worried about security reasons. Like you're like, hey, I need to delete these keys before I send this to someone else, and then I guess you either delete it, or more commonly, people probably just create a new object for you with only the keys that you need and give it to you to. So yes, this exists, but it's definitely not super commonly used. All right. Okay. So the last thing we're talking about today is probably the first relatively new thing we talk about with objects, which is this in operator. So the in operator itself is very simple to understand, right? It's almost like the dot includes function we saw earlier for arrays, right? We just give it a string or a variable, and we use in, and we give it an object. It will tell us, hey, does that key exist in the object? Pretty straightforward, right? I'm gonna get back either true or false. There are no other possible answers. So that's the in operator. And in case you can't tell yet, in obviously is also a reserved word in JavaScript. You cannot use it for anything else because this is what it does. The more complex application of the in operator really comes through with the use of a for in loop. So if I give you an array, right, and I ask you to go through the array, I think most of you think, oh, great, a for loop. That's that's how I do it, right? And you're right, like that's one pretty easy way to iterate through an array. But for an object, right, if I want to go through every single word definition in the dictionary, how do I do it? And so JavaScript gave you something called a for in loop, which helps you iterate through all the keys in an object. And like if you ever look at this slide again, like make sure to really emphasize like what the for in loop really does is it only iterates you through the keys. It will say, here's all the words that exist in this dictionary. If you want the definition, you have to do what? You need to ask for the definition from the object, right? If I give you just the keys, if you want the value for that key, you need to access the value for that by giving the object the key, right? And so here, so the syntax for the for loop looks almost like like a very short version of the normal for loop, right? We have for with our let keyword. We're creating this variable called key. This variable can be whatever you want it to be, right? This is just any variable you want, no restrictions. For let key in and then the object. And what this will do is this will just eventually iterate through every single every single key in your object. Two of the things that people struggle with here, right? One is if you use an object, in an array, like the order in which you kind of add things to the array matters, right? Like the first thing is first for a reason, the third thing is the third for a reason. With an object, order doesn't really matter. Like everything's kind of on one even plane. And so if you're trying to use a data type in which order matters, don't use an object. Actually, is kind of probably going to be like what most people would tell you, right? So an object's like, it's like how in a dictionary, like no word is more important than the other ones. Right, like we sort them alphabetically to make it easy to look up, but inherently, like there's no like the word apple isn't any more important than the word whale, even though it comes so far ahead in a dictionary, right? And so when you use an object, order doesn't matter. And so when we use a for loop, this will go through every single key for you, and it will do. But don't think that there's an order to the keys. Like the keys aren't alphabetical; they're actually based mostly on when the keys were created. But anywho, the point here is like when you use this, don't worry about like in what order you're going through the keys. This will go through every single key for you. If you're saying, well, the order matters, then the rebuttal will be, well, you shouldn't be using an object to start with. If you're saying, well, I want to skip some of the keys, then you shouldn't be using a for loop, right? Like just think of a for loop as something that goes through the keys in a fairly randomized manner, even though it's not random. Okay, so the for loop will go through every single key for you. The second thing that people kind of get tripped up on is, once again, this is just a key, right? That variable is just the key. It's not the value. If I want the value like I print out here, notice how we print out Pusheen's key is, and then Pusheen, index key, right? Here, we're actually going back to the object and say, hey, we heard you have this key. What's the value associated, right? So here, we do go back into the object, and we access the value directly through the object. So once again, for loop only gives you access to the key, not the value. If you want the value, you got to go ask for it yourself from the object. Cool? Okay. This is just a reiteration of what I just said. So feel free to take a look at it. It doesn't add anything new. This just tells you it goes through every single object. And then this is the last thing. I think this answers Jake's question of, well, what if I want all the keys in an array, or I want to know how many keys there are? The object class, much like how the array class has an isArray method, object class is one, also a thing, and two, they have a bunch of things that could help you, there are a bunch of built-in functions that help you. One of them is object.keys. If I use object.keys and I pass in the keys, it will give me back all the keys in an array. Okay, so if I want to just look at all the keys in an array format, object.keys is like a built-in JavaScript thing that kind of helps you do that. object.values also exists. So if you want to look at just the values in an array format, that also works. Yeah. But once again, like just don't get too hung up on the order, I guess.
Can I ask a question?
Totally.
Going
here.
back to the for in loop
Yep.
slide.
Which this one? I guess they're both the same. So
Yeah. So we're in where it says key in the for in loop. Did you say
which
that?
line number?
9.
Line 9. Okay.
So did you say key is always going to be key or
No,
it
key
be a
can be
variable?
anything you want.
Okay.
That's just a variable, right? It's just
Okay.
let variable name in object.
But that just means it asks for every key.
Yep. It just means that if we use like let's say we call it like Megan's secret variable here, we just got to use it everywhere else in here where we use key. It's just it's literally just a variable name.
Okay.
Nothing special about it. Anything else?
So
Yeah.
that just defaults to everything that's in the object. Like,
That defaults to going through every single key in your object. Yes.
is there a way to like make it do just the first 10?
Don't use this. Use something else. And also, when you say first 10, there is no first. So, right? Like if the order really mattered to you in a certain way, you wouldn't use an object to store it because objects inherently have no order. Yeah. Osiris.
Yes, about how I get the value of I want to know like how to get the value when you have instead of like three brackets. How to explain this? And when you have like there's an example I was checking out. I was trying to get the value of the key, but instead it was inside another. I was inside another object. It's like one object inside another object.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I think. Hold up. Might be on the next slide. Are you talking about nested objects? Okay, I think you are. Can you hold yourself for like 2 more slides, and then we'll come back to the very end of class if you still have that same question. Okay. So this is the last thing we're talking about today. So remember how we had nested arrays? We talked about yesterday with Shannon, which is like, hey, I have an array inside an array inside an array inside an array, right? So I just keep using bracket notation, bracket notation, bracket notation, bracket notation, like kind of infinitely, really, like as far as I want, as long as there's enough arrays to support it. That same thing applies to objects too, right? So another way in which objects and arrays are just very, very parallel to each other. Here you'll notice we have Pusheen still. Notice how Pusheen, the value for colors is an array. So if I want to access the first color in the colors array, Pusheen.colors, that's going to give me this array, and then give me the 0th index or the first position in this array. And I get back gray, and then I also get back tabby, right? So we can chain together these things now really easy, right? So before we were chaining together multiple nested arrays, now we can do an object.key, and then chain together with an array. Or if we want, we can just go straight to nested arrays, which is everything's an array, right? And this is, by the way, extremely common in the real world, especially when we're using APIs. Earlier, I was telling Jake about how if I was asked Facebook for his data, it would tell me, Jake's first name is this, last name is this. Well, a lot of things they will probably want to tell me about Jake are probably nested in other things. So it'd be like Jake's, like movie preferences, right? And it'd be like genres, and then films, and then years, and all this stuff, right? So using nested objects, which is basically having an object as the value for a key in an object, extremely common. And the way we access it is literally the way we do it here, right? Here we're using dot notation, so we do Pusheen dot siblings, which is now gives us this object, dot sister, which gives us Stormy, Stormy dot pip. We can use bracket notation. It works literally the same exact way. We can mix and match if you want to. Yeah, it's literally the same as nested arrays. Was this what we're talking about, Osiris?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Josh?
Can you go back to the other slide with colors?
Yep.
With the index value?
Yep.
If you did it in bracket notation,
Still works for colors.
but would the apostrophe go after the S or after the last bracket?
The
Because
apostrophes
colors
would go after the word colors to indicate that it's a string and not a variable
then-
called colors.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah. So it would, I won't change it now, but it will look something like this. You see it? You see it?
Oh, okay.
Right. The only thing the only point for us having the quote there is to indicate that colors is a string and not a variable name. Okay. Cool. And I think that's pretty much it. Yep, that was the entire lesson. Any questions? Objects. Hopefully the only new thing here is dot notation and the for in operator, right? Or like, did you cover a lot of other things in the pre-work with like basic object stuff? There was no objects in the pre-work?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
Or
Well,
arrays.
okay. Sorry about that then. I guess this is all new. Well, okay. In that case, then definitely, are there any questions about anything I've talked about with objects and arrays? Or I guess mostly just objects, but also anything to do with arrays as well. Yeah, and this also kind of wraps up our like kind of first half of class, which has been kind of mostly on the primary data types, right? Like how do we use objects? How do we use arrays? How do we use most like how do we use like a lot of like different string methods and coercion. The second half of this curriculum will definitely be more focused on like functions and kind of how to use things back and forth. The other thing I'll say is that like if you have any questions, like definitely don't be afraid to ask, because what's going to happen is everything we teach is in a certain order and it really builds on top of one another. And so if you're like